In the heart of a bustling city, nestled among the high-rises and bustling streets, lay the old Victorian building that housed the last course. The restaurant was infamous, not only for its eclectic cuisine, but for the eerie rumors that cloaked its storied past. Stories whispered of shadows moving of their own accord, dishes clattering in the dead of night, and a presence that seemed to linger long after the guests had departed. The protagonist, Elise, a young and ambitious chef, had recently taken the helm of the last course. She was determined to restore its former glory, unswayed by the murmurs of its haunted reputation. On her first night, as she stepped into the dimly lit kitchen, a cold draft swept through, causing her to shiver. She brushed it off as a quirk of the old building. As the night wore on, Elise and her staff prepared for the grand reopening. The restaurant was fully booked, and the air buzzed with anticipation. Guests began to fill the dining room, their laughter and chatter a stark contrast to the silence that had pervaded the space just hours before. The first course went out without a hitch, and the patrons were delighted. However, as the night deepened, so did the strangeness. Elise was in the kitchen plating the second course when she heard a waiter, James, gasp. She looked up to see him staring at a painting on the wall, one that depicted the original owner of the last course, a stern woman with piercing eyes. James swore he saw her eyes follow him as he walked. Trying to keep the mood light, Elise joked, maybe she approves of the new menu. But her laughter was cut short when the lights flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. A sense of unease began to creep over her, but she pushed it aside, focusing on her culinary creations. As the main course was served, the atmosphere turned decidedly chilly. Guests at a corner table complained of a sudden cold spot, and one woman claimed she felt a hand brush against her back when no one was near. Elise, growing more concerned, decided to check the circuit breaker, thinking the electrical issues might be causing the temperature drops. In the basement, the air was thick with the mustiness of old stone and wood. The circuit breaker was off in a secluded corner. As Elise made her way through the cluttered space, she felt a palpable sense of being watched. Reaching the breaker, she flicked the switches, but the moment she did, a loud bang echoed through the room, and the door slammed shut above her. Heart racing, Elise rushed back to the stairs, her footsteps quick and sharp against the cold floor. She called out, but her voice was muffled, absorbed by the thick air around her. When she reached the door, she found it stuck, unyielding to her desperate tugs. Back upstairs, the disturbances grew more frequent. Glasses shattered without contact, and a mirror in the restroom cracked right down the middle as patrons watched in horror. The cheerful buzz of conversation turned to nervous murmurs, and Elise's staff struggled to maintain a semblance of normalcy. Finally, Elise managed to force the door open, rushing back to the kitchen. She was met with chaos. The staff were rattled, and the patrons were on edge. Gathering her composure, she reassured everyone, trying to downplay the incidents as mere quirks of the old building. As the evening drew to a close, and the last of the diners left, Elise and her staff began to clean up. That's when the full force of the haunting revealed itself. The lights dimmed to a near darkness, and the temperature dropped sharply. From the dining room came the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. Elise and her team froze, listening as the steps grew louder, closer. The kitchen door swung open with a creak, and there, framed in the dim light, was the silhouette of a woman. Her figure was indistinct, but her presence was overwhelming. She moved forward, her footsteps silent now. Elise, heart-pounding, could only watch as the figure stopped just short of the light, her features obscured by shadow. Suddenly, the lights blazed back to life, and the figure vanished. The room felt normal again, the earlier chill gone as if it had never been. The staff exhaled, sharing uneasy glances. Elise, shaken, knew this was only the beginning. Whatever haunted the last course, it was clear that the night's events were merely an introduction. As she locked up, her mind raced with questions and fears about what lay in store. How could she protect her staff and patrons? And what did the apparition want? As the key turned in the lock, sealing the restaurant in darkness, a whisper of winds seemed to echo through the empty streets, carrying with it a whispered promise, "I will return." The days that followed were tense and fraught with anxiety for Elise. She scoured the library for any historical records of the last course, hoping to uncover something about the restaurant's past that could explain the hauntings. The more she read, the clearer it became that the restaurant's history was marred by tragedy. A fire in the early 1900s had claimed several lives, including that of the original owner, the stern woman from the painting. Elise's heart sank as she connected the haunting events to the fire's victims, their spirits perhaps unrest. Determined to put an end to the disturbances, Elise contacted a local paranormal investigation team. They arrived equipped with all manner of devices, EMF meters, temperature sensors, and night vision cameras. The team was skeptical at first, but as they set up their equipment, the air grew thick, the now familiar chill settling over the room like a cloak. As night fell, the team began their investigation, moving methodically through the dining room. The leader, a grizzled man named Carl, instructed his team to be vigilant. They hadn't been at it long when a sudden drop in temperature was recorded near the corner table where the first complaints had arisen. The EMF meter spiked, and a soft, disembodied voice murmured through the static of their audio equipment, though the words were indistinguishable. The investigators followed the trail of cold spots into the kitchen, where the air felt denser, almost suffocating. Carl, who had been doing this for years, remarked that it was one of the strongest presences he'd ever felt. They set up a camera aimed at the kitchen door, where Elise had seen the apparition. The wait was tense, each second stretching out interminably. Hours passed with minor disturbances, a whisper here, a shadow flickering at the edge of vision there, until, just past midnight, a loud crash echoed from the basement. The team rushed down, finding a stack of old wine bottles shattered on the floor, though the room had been empty. The temperature here was frigid, their breaths visible in the air as they set up more equipment. Back upstairs, Elise watched the live feed from the cameras. Her eyes were glued to the screen, watching every shadow, every anomaly. Then, on the camera pointed at the kitchen door, a figure appeared. It was her, the woman from the painting, standing just in the doorway. Her image was grainy and flickered in and out of visibility. Elise's heart raced as she called Carl over the walkie-talkie. "Carl, you need to see this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Carl and the team crowded around the monitor. The figure stood motionless, watching, it seemed, as they watched her. Then, as they stared, the figure raised a hand, pointing directly at them through the camera. A cold wind swept through the room, the doors banging shut simultaneously throughout the restaurant, and the screen went black. When the video feed snapped back, the figure was gone. The investigators were visibly shaken, their skepticism replaced by a dawning realization of the gravity of their situation. Carl turned to Elise, his face serious. "We need to do more than just observe," he said. "There's a strong spiritual energy here, and it's not at peace. We need to find out what it wants, why it's still here." They decided to attempt communication using a spirit box, which would allow real-time interaction. Setting up in the kitchen, where the activities seemed most concentrated, they turned on the device, its static filling the room. Carl began to speak, his voice steady. "If there is anyone here with us, can you tell us your name?" he asked into the charged silence that followed. The static crackled, and then a voice came through, clear and unmistakable amidst the white noise. "Margaret," it said, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that frost began to form on the inside of the windows. "Margaret, is there something you want to tell us?" Carl continued, his team recording every moment. The voice returned, stronger this time, tinged with an emotion that sounded like sorrow. "Fire, not my fault, they blamed me." The investigation went deep into the night, with Margaret's spirit recounting the tale of the fire, her voice growing more agitated. She spoke of being wrongfully blamed for the tragedy, of her life's work ruined and her spirit unable to rest with the weight of undeserved guilt. As dawn approached, the air in the last course lightened slightly, the oppressive feel lifting as Margaret's story unfolded. But the resolution was not yet complete. They needed to find a way to clear her name, to grant her the peace she had been denied for over a century. Elise knew what she had to do next. As she prepared to close the restaurant for the day, planning to delve into historical archives and legal documents from the time of the fire, a sense of purpose filled her. She was no longer just a chef, she was a seeker of truth, determined to untangle the web of lies and misfortune that bound Margaret's spirit to the last course. Elise's research led her deep into the city's historical society archives. She sifted through old newspapers, fire department reports, and court documents, her eyes scanning for any clue that might help clear Margaret's name. The task was daunting, the dust of forgotten years clinging to every page. Each document seemed to deepen the mystery, portraying Margaret as a villain responsible for the tragedy. Yet, Elise felt a pull, a conviction that there was more to the story. Meanwhile, back at the restaurant, the paranormal activity intensified. Objects began to move with increasing violence, hurled across rooms by unseen forces. Shadows flitted through the dining room in broad daylight, and the temperature fluctuations became more pronounced, leaving patches of ice on the bar counter even as the outside basked in midday warmth. One evening, as Elise pored over a particularly promising lead in a dim corner of the archive room, the lights flickered above her. The atmosphere thickened, a palpable charge filling the air as if a storm were brewing indoors. She looked up from her work, her heart hammering as the documents on the table rustled as though caressed by an unseen hand. "Margaret," she whispered into the silence, half expecting no answer. A soft sigh echoed through the room, and a document from the edge of the table slid across the surface, stopping in front of her. It was a faded letter, the handwriting elegant but hurried. Elise read it eagerly. It was from a former employee of the last course, written to his sister, confessing that he had accidentally started the fire that tragic night and had remained silent out of fear as Margaret took the blame. Elise's breath caught in her throat. This was it, the proof she needed. She carefully placed the letter in her bag, intent on bringing it to Carl and the paranormal team. As she left the archive, the lights stabilized, and the oppressive air seemed to ease, as if the building itself was breathing a sigh of relief. The next night, Elise presented the letter to the investigation team, who had gathered at the restaurant for another attempt to communicate with Margaret. They set up the spirit box again in the heart of the dining area, where the air was cool and expectant. Carl began the session, his voice echoing slightly in the still room. "Margaret, we have found something that might interest you. We believe this could help you find peace." The static on the spirit box hummed, then a voice emerged, clearer and more coherent than any they had heard before. "Thank you," it whispered, the sorrow palpable even through the mechanical distortion of the device. They read the letter aloud to Margaret, each word lifting some of the heaviness in the air. As they finished, a warm breeze swept through the room, unusual given the previous cold spots. It was as though the restaurant itself was exhaling, releasing the tension that had built up over decades. But the night was not over yet. As the warm breeze faded, a cold draft swept in, chilling them to the bone. The lights flickered wildly, and a loud crash came from the kitchen. The team turned just in time to see kitchen knives embedding themselves with great force into the wooden table where they had been laid out. "Not yet," echoed a new, malevolent voice through the static of the spirit box, a voice that was not Margaret's. The team froze, realizing that while they had been communicating with Margaret, another presence had been lurking in the shadows. This spirit was not seeking redemption or peace, it radiated anger and resentment. The temperature dropped, frost creeping across the windows, and the lights dimmed to a faint glow. Carl looked around at his team, his expression grave. "We've got another entity here, and it's not friendly. We need to prepare for a more complex situation than we thought." As they strategized, the air grew denser, the shadows in the corners of the restaurant deepening, coalescing into forms that were almost human. The last course was not yet free of its past, and the night promised more revelations and, undoubtedly, more terror. Elise clenched her fists, bracing herself. She knew this was only the beginning. The battle to cleanse the last course had just escalated, revealing layers of the haunted tapestry that were darker and more intricate than she could have imagined. As the shadows swirled and the cold seeped deeper into her bones, she prepared to face whatever horrors lay ahead, her resolve hardening. The story of the last course was far from over, and she was ready to confront whatever lay hidden in its ghostly depths. Elise's determination to confront the newly revealed entity in the last course was palpable as she and the team prepared for what they anticipated to be a challenging night. Carl had called in additional help, experts in malevolent hauntings, knowing that the entity they faced was far from the mournful spirit of Margaret. The restaurant, once a place of culinary delight, now felt like the epicenter of an unending nightmare. As darkness enveloped the city, the team gathered in the main dining room, their faces lit by the soft glow of emergency lights and the screens of their monitoring equipment. The air was thick with anticipation and a hint of fear, fear of what they were about to face, fear of the unknown force that had made its presence terrifyingly clear. Carl briefed the team, his voice steady despite the oppressive atmosphere. "Tonight, we deal with something far more dangerous than a restless spirit seeking justice. We need to be vigilant, watch each other's backs, and be prepared for anything." He looked each team member in the eye, reinforcing the gravity of their undertaking. The investigation began with a sweep of the restaurant, using thermal cameras and EMF readers. The team split into two groups, one starting in the basement where the wine bottles had shattered the night before, and the other in the kitchen, the site of recent violent activity. Elise joined the group in the kitchen. As they entered, the air turned icy, their breath visible in the ghostly light. She could feel the malevolence in the room, a palpable force that seemed to push against them, as if trying to drive them out. Suddenly, a set of knives flew off the magnetic strip, narrowly missing one of the team members and clanging violently on the floor. "Something is trying to intimidate us," said Jenna, a seasoned investigator specializing in hostile hauntings. She adjusted the settings on her EMF reader, which was spiking erratically. "Stay focused. Don't let it get into your heads." Meanwhile, in the basement, the other group experienced disturbances of their own. A heavy, oppressive silence filled the space, broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the occasional drip of water from an old pipe. As they neared the back of the basement, a shadow darted across the wall, too quick to be human, too substantial to be dismissed as a trick of the light. Back in the kitchen, Elise felt a sudden chill, the temperature dropping several degrees in seconds. Her breath formed clouds in the freezing air, and a low growl echoed around them, the sound seeming to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The lights flickered, casting dancing shadows that twisted into grotesque shapes. "We need to establish communication," Jenna said, setting up a spirit box in the center of the kitchen. "If it's intelligent, we might be able to reason with it, find out what it wants." The spirit box crackled to life, the static cutting sharply through the tense silence. Jenna spoke into the darkness, her voice firm. "We know you're here. Why are you tormenting this place?" The response was almost immediate, a voice emerging from the static, deep and distorted. "Mine," it growled, the single word laced with hostility. "Your claim is not recognized," Jenna replied, maintaining her composure despite the chilling reply. "You're causing harm. This needs to end." The atmosphere thickened, the air charged with an unseen energy. A series of loud bangs came from the ceiling, as if something massive were slamming against it from above. The team remained still, their eyes scanning the shadows. Elise, though scared, felt a surge of anger. This entity was a bully, using fear as its weapon. She stepped forward, her voice stronger than she felt. "This place belongs to the living. You need to leave." The temperature plummeted further, a visible frost spreading across the stainless steel surfaces of the kitchen. The spirit box screeched, a high-pitched, ear-splitting sound, and then went silent. The pressure in the room increased, as if the air itself were being squeezed. Then, as suddenly as it had escalated, the atmosphere lightened. The temperature began to rise back to normal, and the oppressive feeling lifted slightly. The team looked around, puzzled by the sudden change. "This isn't over," Carl said, checking the readings on his equipment. "It's retreated, but it hasn't gone. We might have pushed it back, but it's still here, somewhere." The team regrouped, discussing their next steps. They needed more information, more understanding of what this entity was and why it had claimed the last course as its own. The investigation would have to be deeper, more thorough. They needed to delve into the history of the land, the building, and anything else that might give them a clue to the nature of their unseen adversary. Permanent monitoring stations around the restaurant, determined to capture any occurrence that might provide further insight into the haunting. Elise, though exhausted, felt a relentless drive to uncover the truth and to reclaim the peace of her restaurant from the clutches of the malevolent entity. The team decided to dig into the historical archives of the city, hoping to uncover any records that might shed light on past events that could be fueling the haunting. As they worked, the restaurant remained closed to the public, its atmosphere heavy and unwelcoming. Elise spent days poring over old land deeds, newspaper clippings, and personal diaries from the library's special collections. Buried in a box of personal effects donated by an old family, she found a diary belonging to a woman who lived in the area in the late 1800s. The entries were sporadic, but one entry caught Elise's attention. It spoke of a dispute over the ownership of the land where the last course now stood, a bitter feud that ended in violence and tragedy. Meanwhile, the surveillance equipment captured intermittent disturbances, shadows that moved against the laws of physics, cold spots that appeared and vanished without reason, and disembodied voices that whispered in the dead of night. The team analyzed every frame, every audio clip, but it was the diary entry that provided the next clue. Elise and Carl discussed the findings. This land was cursed, caught in a feud that ended in bloodshed, Elise summarized, her eyes tired but determined. Perhaps what we're dealing with is the fallout from that hatred, a residual haunting or something stronger. Carl nodded, his expression grim. We've seen spirits tied to places because of intense emotional or traumatic events. It's possible the entity doesn't even fully understand why it's here. It's just reliving its anger and pain. Determined to find a resolution, they contacted a specialist in historical hauntings, Dr. Helena Moss, who suggested they attempt to cleanse the area not just physically, but also spiritually. You must address the source of the haunting, she advised. Acknowledging the past, seeking forgiveness, may help appease the spirit. The team prepared for a night-long vigil aimed at cleansing the restaurant. They arranged for a local priest and a shaman to lead the rituals, blending different beliefs and practices in hopes of reaching the entity. The community around the restaurant, intrigued and supportive, contributed their own pieces of advice and blessings. As the sun set, the team, along with the priest and shaman, gathered inside the last course. Candles were lit, incense burned, and circles of salt were laid out. The air was thick with the sense of sage and myrrh, the flickering candlelight casting eerie shadows on the walls. The shaman began chanting in a rhythmic tone, shaking a rattle made from dried gourds. The priest recited prayers of protection and peace, sprinkling holy water around the room. Elise and the team stood within the salt circle, watching, waiting. The temperature dropped, a now familiar sign of the entity's presence. A wind seemed to sweep through the room, extinguishing candles as it passed. The shaman's chant grew louder, more insistent. The air vibrated with the power of the ritual, the walls themselves seeming to pulse. Then, silence fell. A heavy, suffocating silence that filled the room, pressing down on them. From the shadows, a figure emerged, its form vague and shifting. The temperature plummeted further, breaths visible in the icy air. We acknowledge the pain that occurred on this land, the shaman called out to the figure. We seek to bring peace, to right the wrongs of the past. The figure paused, its form becoming more defined, a man with a stern expression, dressed in the garb of the late 1800s. His eyes, filled with sorrow and rage, fixed on Elise and the others. You trespass on my despair, the entity's voice echoed through the room, hollow and filled with grief. We wish to heal this land, to honor all who have suffered here, the priest responded, his voice steady. The entity's gaze softened slightly, the air around them warming a fraction. The candles flickered back to life spontaneously, casting a gentle light that seemed to push back the darkness. But as the rituals continued, a series of loud bangs echoed from the basement, as if something were trying to break free. The entity's form flickered, its expression twisting into one of confusion and fear. It's not alone, Carl whispered, his eyes wide as he glanced at the monitoring equipment, which showed massive spikes in paranormal activity. As they prepared to delve deeper, to confront whatever lay in the shadows of the last course, the team realized this night was only the beginning. Whatever resided within the walls of the restaurant was ancient, complex, and not easily appeased. The fight to reclaim the last course from the depths of its haunted past was far from over. As the entity's form stabilized, the disturbances in the basement intensified. The thumping became a cacophonous roar, as if an ancient machinery had awoken beneath the restaurant. The team felt the floor tremble under their feet, each vibration a stark reminder of the forces they were meddling with. "Whatever is below us, it's powerful," Carl stated, his voice tense. "We need to confront it directly." With a collective nod, the team, accompanied by the priest and shaman, moved towards the basement door, their equipment in hand, ready to record and analyze whatever they might encounter. The air grew colder as they descended the steps, each footfall echoing ominously around them. In the basement, the atmosphere was suffocating, as if the air itself was thick with the residue of centuries-old grievances. The lights flickered violently, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and writhe on their own. At the far end of the room, the stone wall appeared to pulsate slightly, a dark energy emanating from its core. Elise, leading the group, approached the wall cautiously. "This is the source," she whispered, her breath forming a cloud in the frigid air. Her hand hovered over the stone, feeling the cold seep into her bones. The shaman began an intense incantation, the rhythm of his words seeming to penetrate the stone itself. The priest joined in, his prayers echoing in the cramped space, forming a duet of hope and resolve against the backdrop of creeping dread. Suddenly, the wall began to crumble, small stones falling away to reveal a hidden cavity. Inside, they saw an array of ancient artifacts, bones wrapped in tattered cloth, rusted iron tools, and a collection of personal belongings, each item pulsing with a palpable energy. "These are tethering objects," the shaman explained, his voice urgent. "They bind the spirits to this place. We need to release them." One by one, they removed the objects, handling each with care. As they did, the atmosphere in the basement began to shift. The oppressive energy started to dissipate, replaced by a lighter, almost relieved feeling. The entity's form appeared at the threshold of the cavity, watching silently as its anchors to the physical world were dismantled. "Thank you," it whispered, its voice fading like mist. "For freeing us." The entity's form dissipated completely, leaving behind a sense of peace that had long been absent from the last course. The team felt a weight lift from their shoulders, the tension of the night unraveling as the spirits found their release. With the main source of the haunting addressed, the team exited the basement, feeling the first true silence the building had offered since they'd begun their investigation. The restaurant no longer felt like a battleground. Instead, there was a somber tranquility, a respect for what had occurred there. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Elise stood at the entrance of the last course, looking back at the building. It had been a long night, one that had tested her resolve and her bravery, but ultimately, it had led to the liberation of tortured souls who had lingered far too long. Carl approached her, a small smile on his face. "It's over, for now. But remember, places like this, with such a deep history, they often hold more secrets, more stories waiting to be told." Elise nodded, her eyes reflecting the morning light. "We'll be ready," she said, a note of determination in her voice. "Whatever comes, we'll face it. But today, we've brought peace. That's enough for now." As they packed up their equipment, the team shared a quiet sense of accomplishment. The last course would reopen, not just as a restaurant, but as a monument to the past and a beacon of hope for the future. The spirits were at rest, the haunting had ceased, and life, with all its complexities and challenges, would continue. And so, as the sun rose higher in the sky, Elise locked the door behind her, a chapter closed, with the knowledge that the story of the last course was far from over. As Elise turned the key in the lock of the last course, the early morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone street, a reminder that light and dark existed in perpetual balance. She took a deep breath, feeling the crisp air fill her lungs, a stark contrast to the heavy, haunted atmosphere that had pervaded the restaurant just hours before. Walking away from the building, Elise couldn't shake the feeling that her connection to the last course was not yet severed. There was a profound sense of accomplishment, yes, but also an undercurrent of something unfinished, a narrative that whispered promises of more to come. However, for the first time since taking over the restaurant, she felt hope instead of dread. The spirits that had once tormented the space had been acknowledged and set free, their stories told and their pain honored. But the world of the paranormal knew no final acts, only pauses, and Elise was keenly aware of this. The liberation of the spirits was a victory, yet the history of the land on which the last course stood was layered and complex, each layer potentially holding its own mysteries and disturbances. Over the following weeks, Elise threw herself into the revitalization of the restaurant. The last course reopened its doors, not just as a dining establishment, but as a place imbued with history and respect for the past. Patrons came not only for the culinary delights, but also for the ambience of a place touched by the supernatural, yet no longer ruled by it. The grand reopening was a resounding success. Guests marveled at the restored interior, which Elise had carefully designed to honor the building's historic roots while infusing modern comforts. The walls, once witnesses to eerie hauntings, now showcased beautiful portraits of the area's history, including one of Margaret, whose story of wrongful blame and redemption had touched many. As the evening progressed, Elise mingled with guests, sharing stories of the recent events, the investigations, and the cleansing. The community's response was overwhelmingly positive, with many expressing a newfound respect for the site. Yet, even amidst the laughter and music, Elise's eyes were occasionally drawn to the corners of the rooms, to the shadows that seemed just a bit too deep, a subtle reminder that the veil between worlds was thin here. Later that night, after the last guest had departed and the staff were busy cleaning up, Elise took a moment to herself in the kitchen. The room was quiet, the only sound the soft clinking of dishes and the distant hum of the refrigerator. It was here, in this very spot, that she had felt the most intense presence of the angry spirit, and where she had stood firm against it. As she reflected on the past events, a slight chill swept through the room. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, not in fear, but in anticipation. Turning slowly, she half expected to see a remnant of the past, a shadow or an echo of the entity that had once claimed this space. But there was nothing. Only the faint, almost imperceptible scent of sage left over from the cleansing rituals, and a gentle warmth that seemed to radiate from the walls themselves, as if the building was breathing a sigh of relief along with her. Smiling to herself, Elise turned off the kitchen light and headed towards the exit. She knew that true hauntings never really ended, they only transformed, became stories to be told, lessons to be learned. And the last course, with its deep roots and restless spirits, had many stories yet to reveal. As she locked the door behind her, looking up at the building that had become her life's work, the moon broke through the clouds, casting a silvery glow over the restaurant. For a moment, it seemed to Elise that the building winked at her, an old friend assuring her that it was at peace, at least for now. And with a final glance, she turned and walked away, the echo of her footsteps mingling with the whispering wind, carrying tales of the past into the shadowy embrace of the night.